It's a great pleasure to have met you again after many years.
Yes, right.
And to have a chance to talk to you about some of your writing and life. You're in many ways one of the most reflective, reflecting of anthropologists, so this is a particular opportunity to see what imprint the elephant has left behind now that it's moved on. I was wondering, when were you born? What year was it?
I was born in 1926 in San Francisco. My parents were divorced before I was 3, and I was sent off to live north of San Francisco in the countryside with an unrelated woman, about 60 or so at the time, I guess she was, woman I call Nana, and it was in Marin County. Now, Marin County now is a very fancy place, but at that time this was the depth of the Depression. It was a little place in the hills called Woodacre, of all places, and it had 200 or 300 people, and I lived a very isolated life there. I went to a 2-room schoolhouse, never went anywhere, did much of anything until the war came, which was then that would have been 15 years or so, 16 years on, and then I joined as soon as I could. Actually, I graduated high school at the age of 17, and went into the Navy, and then ended up in the Pacific. And when I came back, left California more or less permanent. I haven't been back and forth, but I left it as home. And so there's a kind of cleavage in my life that's rather striking to most people when they hear it. It's striking to me, actually. The first 17 years or so were sort of living an isolate rural life in the depths of the Depression. We were poor, but we had enough to eat, and we were warm enough, so it wasn't really that bad. Well, it wasn't as bad as many people had, and there was a lot. But we just lived on, and then I lived. Since then, I've lived a very cosmopolitan life. I've always thought, I lived in a very, very rural atmosphere. I mean, it was very, very countryside, but I was urban from the start. Now, I don't know that, what people would say about that, but I feel that I always was. So once I got out and got east, that's where I felt I belonged, or at least where I wanted to be. And I didn't want to go back because of the complexities of my family. Not only my parents were divorced, everybody in the whole damn family was. It was a mess, but anyway. So I left.
Right.
So much happened. That's the thing. There was a period in which nothing really happened. It's a funny kind of life. It was a rural countryside life, and and I did things and stuff, but nothing.
There was no teacher who...
Yeah, teachers were always my salvation. I was, if I may say so, a smart kid, right? So, and this is a countryside where even the kids who were smart weren't smart. I mean, they weren't supposed to be, so they didn't become. Some of them had good brains, but they didn't. But I was an intellectual to start with. I was alone. I was isolated. I read an enormous amount. And yes, 2 teachers, one in elementary school, who thought I was a cat's pajamas and really taught me to learn how to read things and do things, get involved, whom I still remember with great warmth. I haven't seen her. She's dead now, certainly, but I mean, and then later on, even more importantly, a high school teacher, whom I do mention, I think in something I've written, a man named Lawrence Tardy, who had been a merchant seaman and was a leftist. This was the time in California, of course, where the left labor unions were. This was the time of Harry Bridges. My grandfather was a labor union printer. I mean, we were all connected with that kind of thing indirectly. My father was not; he was a civil servant, but the others were. Anyway, Lawrence Tardy was an not an ex-radical. He's a radical, but he was now teaching high school, and he had a tremendous influence on. In fact, it was he who, after I came back while I was in high school, I was the editor of the high school newspaper. I worked up to the editor of the high school newspaper, and he was the faculty advisor, and he also had a tremendous influence on my reading. I wanted to be a writer and a novelist.
At what age did you want to be a writer?
Very young. As soon as I knew there was such a thing, I think. I mean, I don't know. It's difficult. I never wanted to be a fireman or anything like that. I didn't have that kind of thing that some people have. I always wanted to write, and I always admired writers from very early. And I certainly by the time I got to high school, I wanted to be a writer. And he encouraged that, and I did write some. Later on, I edited college literary magazine, and so on. But anyway, Tardy had a tremendous influence on me. And when I went, as I say, went to the Navy and headed toward Japan to invade it, but the bomb was dropped. We were just about to get there as we turned around and came back. I went to him and said, what do I do now? I had never thought of going to college because we were poor. I mean, not poor, or at least not well off. In those days, everybody didn't go to college. And I hadn't thought that I would go. I expected to work on a telephone company or something, which is what everybody did, or something like that. And he said, well, why don't you... And I had the GI Bill. That was the big... Do you know what the GI Bill is, I guess, for a non-American audience? Once to explain that there was this enormous socialist enterprise in the United States in which any ex-GI, ex-serviceman had the time served plus a year, tuition, books, a living expense. I mean, it was just and anywhere you wanted to go that you could get in. And I said, he said, well, you've got this. Why don't you take it and go ahead? And I said, well, I don't know where to go to college. I didn't really want to go to Berkeley because I didn't want to stay in California. And he said, well, this is sort of, again, left-wing college, experimental college in Ohio called Antioch, where they have this work-study program. You work half-time, you study half-time, and it's a kind of, it was always a very radical place. Ex-radicals teaching there and so on, or not always ex, but anyway, they're there. And I said, okay, and so I applied. Never applied anywhere else. Didn't think of the notion that you could, that you apply and not get in, but I did, and went on. So he had that in, he sent me there, and he formed my sort of sense of self as a literary figure, and and politically he did too, socially. And so, yeah, he was an extraordinary man. So between my grammar school principal, elementary school principal, and my high school English teacher, and some other teachers in high school also had some influence on me. And he wasn't alone, but he was way ahead, the most influential.
Sounds as if your parents didn't have much influence on you.
No.
Except in a negative way.
Yeah, it was negative. I don't... I'm not just stumbling for words because I don't know quite how to put it. They had a non-influence. My father had to be sort of almost forced to pay for my upkeep. And they were rather neglectful. My mother tried sometimes, but I saw my mother maybe once a year. I saw my father maybe once every 2 years. Neither of them wanted to bother with me. I don't want to. Later on, my mother at least tried. I mean, she made an effort sometimes, but it wasn't very effective. My father just was a detached character and wasn't hostile. I mean, I ended up, so to speak, burying both of them because I had to go back when they died, and so which wasn't so long ago. They lived very long, but no, they were just absent. They shouldn't have been parents. I mean, they weren't hostile. I don't not at all. I mean, but they were certainly neglectful, and I was just sort of something that they wanted to send off into the countryside and forget that ever happened.
You were the only child.
Oh yeah. Well, they got divorced. They had been married only a few years, and they had me and got divorced. I mean, that was their marriage. They both remarried. Both remarried well, actually, I must say. They didn't have any children, but in the second marriages. But I liked both my stepfather and my stepmother a good deal, actually. They were very nice people. But and I had some relation to my grandfather, who was this, I say, union printer on the Embarcadero in San Francisco. But I mean, but that was about it. And essentially, family was something for me by the time I got back in the 40s to get far away from. And the whole family was like that. I mean, it was multiplied.
On the war service, did you learn Japanese or?
No, I didn't do that. What I did do was, oddly enough, it'll surprise you here, I was an electronic technician. It's odd because I had wanted to. They had what we call smiling C's, which were classification officers. They had a C on, they were always smiling. So they decided where you went in the Navy. So after going to boot camp, I had to go through boot camp twice because I got scarlet fever in the middle. So it lasted. I was in Farragut, Idaho, in the depth of snow. I'd never seen snow. Anyway, I got through all that finally. And they had this program whereby if you volunteered, you could be, because the Navy, for reasons we didn't know, need to go into, supplied the medical corpsmen for the Marine Corps. That you could do that because it was a non-combatant role. You could volunteer for it. I did volunteer for it, and was about to go into it. In which case I would be dead. I mean, I would have gone to Iwo Jima. I mean, as a hospital corpsman, which is not the greatest idea in the world. Anyway, so I did that, but then alas, they gave IQ tests, and I scored very high on the IQ test. And I went back to see the Smiling Sea, and he said, "You're not going to be a middle corpsman. You're going to be an electronic technician," because they had they needed people. So I had it was the longest and most technical training for non. I was just an ordinary seaman. Later was a petty officer. That's all. And so I went for 3 months to Chicago, a month someplace, then 3 months to Chicago, and then the three or 4 months to Gulfport, Mississippi, and 7 months at Treasure Island in San Francisco. And I wasn't a radar operator, I was a radar repairman. And then I became a technician, a petty officer, third class or second eventually. And I served on a heavy cruiser, a brand new heavy cruiser called the St. Paul, sister ship of the Indianapolis, which was famously sunk while we were at sea, so it was nervous-making. And we were sailing, as I say, toward Japan. I don't know whether we were going to... I thought at that time that we were headed toward Tokyo Bay, but apparently we were not. We were headed toward the south. The invasion was to come from the south. In any case, one day there's this announcement on the loudspeakers that a mystery weapon or something that, the ultimate... They didn't say it was an A-bomb in those days, but some fatal bomb had been dropped. And then it shortly followed by the notion that this is the first we had heard of anything like this, that the Trojan War will not take place. I mean, we weren't going to go in there. And so we sailed around a bit and then turned around and went home. And then all the people who were not regulars, Navy people, were discharged. I mean, so I got off and went back to San Francisco and spent about 4 or 5 months wandering around. Also at the government's expense, they had to also give you $50 a week for 42 weeks until you sort of readjusted yourself to civilian existence. And I wrote then. I spent a good deal of time. I lived in San Francisco in an apartment and wrote short stories and started a novel and various things. And then Tardy said, well, go to, that's it.
When you went to Ohio University, Antioch, were there any teachers there, again, who...
Oh, well, there was a tremendously shaping teacher. I've dedicated books to them and so on. I've even written about one of them, a man named George Geiger, who was John Dewey's last graduate student. He was also the backup to Lou Gehrig on the Columbia baseball team, which he never played. But he was an extraordinary man. He taught philosophy. I majored first in literature and then shifted to philosophy, mainly because in philosophy you could do almost anything you wanted. But I did both. And there were a number of professors who were important, but Geiger was absolutely shaping in my life. He's the man who made me into a kind of intellectual rather than aesthete. I mean, he was very... he's sort of known. He's not famous by any means, and he never will be, but he was more than just an ordinary philosopher. People didn't know of him, and he wrote stuff. Anyway, and it was he who finally, after 4 years working with him and doing things, who said I should go and be an anthropologist. And that was, again, I didn't know what to do with it. I had majored as undergraduate in philosophy and literature, written papers on Emily Dickinson, on Hawthorne, on George Herbert Mead, on Spinoza and so on, but not exactly a great current direction of there. I was very much interested then in new criticism and things of that sort. I edited a literary magazine, same old story. And I wrote. And I didn't know what to do. By then I was married to Hilary. I met her there and married her there. And she was an English major, and she didn't know what to do with either. I mean, neither one of us knew what to do. And I was out of the GI Bill, and Geiger had this American Council Learns This. I've had a lucky life, as you'll see. I mean, it's just everything turns up roses for me somehow. Anyway, he had this very lush grant that the American Council of Learned Societies, which is a covering organization in the United States, still goes on, still does very good work, had this grant program where in each small college, maybe not only small ones, but small ones were the ones where it really counted, as Antioch was. Antioch only were about 1,000 students, and half of them weren't there half the time, so it was very small. In a very small little Ohio town. Again, rural, but the place is very urban. It's all full of urban type. Anyway, in each each college, they took one professor and said, "You give this to anybody you want." So Gardner gave it to me. And I didn't know what to do with it. He says, why don't you try anthropology? And so I had never studied it, read it, or heard about it. Well, I had read Benedict, I think, maybe. I'm not even sure, but I think I did. But I certainly didn't know much about anthropology or have any particular interest in it. And but the reason he said that was because he had been in contact with Clyde Kluckhohn. Well, how that happened, I don't know. Met him somewhere, I guess. And they were just starting the social relations department at Harvard. Kluckhohn, Parsons, Tucker Parsons, Sam Stauffer, Harry Murray, Gordon Allport, that lot, right? That famous enterprise. And he said, why don't you think about going there? And I said, well, what the hell? So I went out and tried to find out what anthropology was a bit. And then I had a friend, a woman whom I knew at Antioch, who was working for Margaret Mead. Margaret was up in that tower, that famous tower in the American Museum of Natural History, which she had. There really was a harem. There were women, young women working for her, and they were all very loyal to her. She said, "Well, I'd get you an interview with Margaret Mead." And of course, by that, Hilly and I were both involved in this, and there was enough on this grant to finance both of us, which is extraordinary for graduate school. So even at that time, I mean, now it would be out of the question. But anyway, that was leisure times right after the war. So we went off to see Margaret, and she didn't know who we were from Adam. I mean, and she spent 2 or 3 hours talking to us, showing us her field notes of Bali, actually, though they were very strange field notes. They were totally behavioristic. You know, Gusti stands up for 2 minutes, walks 30 feet left, sits down for a minute and a half, I mean, they were just incredible, pages and pages of this sort of stuff that she had done with Gregory, I guess partly to go along with the camera stuff. But it was anyway. But she was very enthusiastic, and she said, you know, great, become anthropologists. So we did, and we said, I then went, of course, to Harvard. We applied to Harvard. We both applied. There were only 6 people allowed in for a year in the anthropology section, and Hilly and I both got in, and the rest is, I don't know, history or something.
Just as we pass people by, because we may not come back to them.
Oh, sure.
It's nice to, if there's anything more to be said about them as we go past. So the first major anthropological figure we've met is Margaret Mead. They're, as you know, quite strong.
Well, they always were, yeah.
But your impression, certainly at the beginning, was positive. Did it continue positive?
Oh, yeah. She was, to me, I mean, I can see why people get furious at her. She made people furious. I mean, and did that without motivation, without malice. But she was always extremely kind to me. And always very nice to me. And to Hilly, to both of us. The thing about Margaret is that she didn't have trouble with younger people. She was very good with younger people. But she had trouble with peers, I mean, and superiors. But I don't think she thought there were any superiors. But peers, she had trouble with. But she didn't. But she was very good with younger people. Oh, I don't. Again, I won't want to make a total generalization, but I know a number of younger people who were younger when she was not younger, when she was already established. And the people who worked with her and so on, those women. Later on, and we stayed friends with her. I didn't see her often, and I didn't study with her. And I don't consider myself a follower particularly. I'm not a non-follower, but I just didn't really study with her that much. Later on, Hilly and I were in, and she sort of referred to as in Blackberry Winter. She referred to as friends of hers, younger friends of hers, among other people. I mean, we were in Bali. This was in 1957. As far we're far along, right? I'm already a real anthropologist. Been out there for a year, living in this little town. And there was this cremation, these huge celebrations that the Balinese have to bury the dead. There's thousands of people and so on. But it wasn't in the town. It was down at the coast in a very remote area. And then there was no road. You had to walk in. And we had been down there for about a week. And it's dust and heat and thousands of people, and they have this crazy laughing going on. It's a really discombobulating situation. So Hilly is up at the palace where they cut a hole in the wall to take the body out. With that end of things, then they carry it for about half a mile down to the burning ground. I'm at the burning ground, so we're trying to cover this thing, like a couple of reporters. I do think anthropologists rather like covering news stories anyway, but this is what this was. So I'm standing there, and I've been out there for 4 or 5 days without getting much sleep, and really in the heat and the dust. All of a sudden, the the dust sort of parts, and there, standing leaning on her famous crotchety stick, is Margaret. And I looked at her, and the first thing I say to myself is she real? If you're going to go crazy in the field, this is how an anthropologist is going to go crazy in the field. So I rush up back to, not to Margaret, but back up to Hilly and said, "You're not going to believe this. I got to come. I got to need a reality check." Margaret seems to be standing down there. So we went down and saw her. She was on one of her great trips, going to India, I think, and just had stopped in Bali. Well, why not? Found out where we had been. Went to our little town. Found that we weren't there, but we were way out in this remote place. Hired a car. Walked in on her notoriously terrible legs. She had these ankles. She was carried in out of. She talks about being carried in and out like a pig out of New Guinea, but she was still couldn't, and she walked on the stick. She walked in and she said, "I know anthropology," and then we went up to her. Indeed was she, and we were sane, and she was palpable. And she said, "I know anthropologists don't like other anthropologists and treat them on their field side, and I'm not trying to do that. I came here because I was passing through, and partly I want to see you, but also I have a friend of old standing, fairly rather well known, locally well known, not locally anywhere. There's a Javanese art salesman, museum keeper, what do you call him? A guy had a gallery, named Jimmy Pandy, whom I had not met. And she said, "I'd like you to come to dinner in a couple of days and meet this man, and it would be good for you to meet him." And indeed it would. We were there. And so that was it. That's the story. And 2 days later we did, and on a beautiful beach at Sonora with Margaret. So the answer to your question, she was always extremely kind to me, so I'm never going to say a negative word about her. I can understand why she drives some people crazy. That is, she could be difficult, all right, but she was never difficult with me. She was always very nice to me, and I remember her with great warmth.
Apart from the difficulty, in a recent interview I heard a lot about the Freeman controversy, and I don't know whether, as well as the difficulty, there were she was alleged to have manipulated her data and made up quite a bit.
Well, I don't know. I of course have no way to know that. I have anecdotes about that too. I went to Australia just 10 years ago or so, to the Humanities Center for a summer. I give a general talk, and some guy stands up in the audience and starts asking me questions about why American anthropologists. The talk was not on American anthropology. It was on, I can't remember what it was on, but the question had nothing to do with the subject matter of the talk. Well, it was Derek, and he kept asking these questions, and he kept, while I was there, he sort of kept pursuing me, trying to get me to say something negative about Margaret, or about American anthropology, and why we're all cultural relativists, and my reply was, no, we're not all cultural. I didn't know what else to say. And I don't know if you knew Derek, but he was in and out of phase. I mean, he wasn't always off his head. He was sometimes off his head. I mean, I think he just was. Everybody says he was. And as far as I can see, I didn't know him well enough that I could make a diagnosis what was wrong with him, but he did behave rather oddly. There are millions of stories you've heard. But as for manipulating the data, no, I think, I don't know whether she did or didn't. I thought that it was, I guess my loyalty to Margaret came out in the fact that I felt it was rather cowardly of him to wait till she died. That if you're going to take on Margaret, you ought to take her on, and he could have done that. I really do not believe that he could not have done it before she died, and then he would have been in for a struggle, and it would have been a fair fight. What the answer to the question is, certainly, Coming of Age in Samoa is not a great book. But she's 26. It's early. It's 1926. She's 26. It's the beginning of things. So I tend to be a little bit less censorious. And some people I know in Samoa say it's not all wrong and so on. But that it's light and superficial, and she may have been. That I don't really know, and I don't have any inside story on that. I never talked to Margaret about it. Well, I never talked to her about Freeman because Freeman didn't appear on the scene until she was dead. He kept writing to me. The other thing, he was a strange man. So I never. While I was in Australia, he kept sending me postcards with funny things on them, not odd statements on them. I never responded because I didn't want to get involved with this man. I never want to be part of somebody else's delusional system. I just figured, I'm not involved in this. I didn't work in Samoa, and I like Margaret personally, and I never did. And even when he did this, even from a distance, I got letters from him and so on, trying to get me involved and so on. Why it was we were all conspiring to do something to him. And I wasn't conspiring at all. I wasn't doing anything. But on the issue itself, there would be people better placed to decide what it was. I don't think Communismo is a great book, but for a 26-year-old woman in 1926, it's not a bad book. It's a rather interesting, but maybe not a good anthropology book.
Coming back to Harvard, and another figure there, one of the earliest books I ever read in anthropology was Clive Klucker's Mirror for Man, and
yes.
Another witchcraft. He, from a recent interview I've done, he appears to be quite an eccentric character. Florence was eccentric too.
Yes.
But, is there any sort of anecdotes or pen portraits or impressions?
Well, my relationships with him are really very complicated. He was a tortured man. I think that's something that people really don't know, and I don't know enough. He really was yes, difficult. I got caught between him and Talcott Parsons in a kind of crossfire, in which he publicly lambasted me, and it was very, as I only was a graduate student. It's one of these graduate students get caught between two professors, and it was quite. On the other hand, every time push came to shove, Clive supported me. I mean, he's the reason I got the job at Berkeley. He's the reason I went to Indonesia and so on. So I have no real resentments. My relationships to him, I remember with a certain amount of agony. I mean, I really didn't. But he was tortured. I don't want to get. I have views about that, but I don't. That's not the sort of thing.
East European. It's a strange name. Is it? Was he East European?
No, he wasn't. Well, I don't know. He's very American. I mean, he may. The Kluckhohn is not his own name. That's the other thing. He was adopted. He grew up in Iowa. His parents, I guess, died. He was adopted by the Kluckhohns. He was sick all his life. He had heart trouble from very early on. Was sent to the Southwest. That's where he got to become a Navajo specialist. Because I just want to be careful here, but he was a conflicted, deeply conflicted man. He was a wild Cold warrior, and he ran the Russian Research Center. His son, as you may have known, that got in trouble for he shot a woman out of a window, supposedly accidentally, but who knows? Anyway, so their story, and Florence was also. She had an odd disease of some sort too. Florence was my wife's thesis director. She got along with her all right. And I had no trouble with Florence particularly, but they drank heavily. I mean, I don't want to get too personal because it's not right to do that. But I think it's fair enough to say that they were not a happy crew. And on the other hand, it must be said that Clyde really supported me. He really did think I was going to do some good work, and he was hard to deal with personally, very, very hard to deal with. He played favorites shamelessly. I mean, in an open way, played people off against each other. I mean, there's nothing new about that. You've heard that. I mean, I won't say who would, but but he was not a simple man. But I feel, despite what I just seem to be saying, I feel gratitude toward him. Yes, I feel warmly toward him, even though it was painful. There's been occasions where it was just awful.
What about the other magnet in the other direction, Talcott Parsons? Well,
Talcott altogether different. Talcott was a bunny. I mean, people have usually overemphasized Talcott's influence on me, which I can't do. When toward the end of his life, Talcott was attacked from all sides, and I personally took a resolution that I'm not going to do that because he had been very good to me also. Though I myself never really followed his line of thought and so on. But Talcott was a very benevolent character. He was a very nice man, very easy, very strange, a little bit. I don't mean this as a clinical one, but schizzy-ish. He was a little removed, and he didn't quite know what was going on in Talcott's big dome and so on. But and he had these elaborate schemes and so on. And I taught a course with him once, enjoyed it, and he was very, very good to me. And so I've always taken a resolution I wasn't going to join in this. Even though I think my work is often over-assimilated to that, but that's another long story. We can talk about that later if you want. But Talcott personally was benevolent, and I think one thing to say one should remember about Talcott is the range of really good students he produced. David Schneider, Bob Bella, me, I guess, but other people, you don't know, maybe as Joe Berger. Okay, he had an enormous range from infrared to ultraviolet, positives, all kind. Renee Fox, who's probably the main medical sociologist, a number of major figures now. So the image of him as some sort of intellectual tyrant is all wrong. I mean, it's true, you couldn't budge him about it. The thing about Talcott is he had these things, these enormous schemes. So whenever you tried to disagree with him, he would find a slot for you, and you would say, I would say, Talcott, no, we're in disagreement. No, I know it fits over here. I mean, you're under the I's and the R's, and never could get to Talcott that, no, on this, you and I are not of one mind. But he felt he could absorb he had a Hegelian mind. It was all going to be interpreted into the system. So you felt like you were floundering around in a sea of stuff. But he was a warm man and a very intelligent man, and I learned an enormous amount from him. The thing is, you don't learn from Talcott by learning the system. You learn from going, someday somebody will do an editing job on Parsons and take out the parts that are really valuable, because some of the stuff that's now supposed to be very avant-garde, about power, about status, he had years ago. It's there, but it's buried under 16, pages of something else. So, and as I say, he and more on, I think, Clyde's side, but though I don't really know the inside stories of this, had a kind of, after a while, there was a great tension. And I got caught between it because I was working a little bit with Talcott, though I was mainly under Clyde. And that led to me getting sort of fired out from both sides. Well, though Talcott he never bothered with that. He was supportive.
He was very influenced, obviously. In many ways, he was the translator and publicizer of Max Weber.
Well, that is where he did have influence on him.
You acknowledge a
That's
very
right.
large influence of Weber.
And that's right. And it's also through him. I had never heard of Weber till I met Talcott.
Was Weber, would you say he is the classical figure who's influenced you most in anthropology, classical sociologist?
Oh, so far and away, yes, still does. Yes, very much so. And, there's always this sort of New Testament, Old Testament view of Weber. I mean, there's Parsons, sort of the New Testament reader, and I got the New Testament version, that's true. But then later on also tried to read Weber directly in German and so on, which I couldn't originally, but I can now, and read it. But Weber, yes, I still consider myself fundamentally a Weberian, yes, very much so.
Anyone else? I mean, Ricoeur you talked about.
Oh, there's an enormous number of people who've had influence on me. Ricoeur, yes, all kinds of people who are not Kenneth Burke, who was a new critic, various kinds of philosophers, and Wittgenstein enormously. I mean, that's a long story, but that is not self-discovered, but I didn't get it from any teacher directly.
Marx at all?
Not so much. I guess if you get started with Weber, you get to be a little bit skeptical of Marx. So, no, I've always been sort of skeptical of Marx and critical. Not really, no. I've read Marx and it has some influence, but on that line I'm more Weber. And then the other figure, of course, is Durkheim, whom I've always had a arm's length relationship to. I admire him in some ways, but I really don't like it in some other ways. So, of course, again with Talcott, he was going to bring all these together: Marx and Durkheim and Pareto and Weber, all one big happy family, called all with parsnip names. And again, he was a very optimistic character, and he had this sort of. And I didn't have that. I tend to be a fox, not a hedgehog, very much of a fox. And he was the ultimate hedgehog. I'm a tremendous. Well, Isaiah Berlin had influence on me too. Isaiah was responsible for me coming to Oxford that year, and so on. There's an enormous number of people who've had influence. I mean, intellectual figures of influence. But Weber is certainly it. And I think if you go the Weber way rather than either the Marx or Durkheim way, it's a natural way for a fox to go. And I am radically a fox. I'm not a...
What about the earlier great tradition of American anthropology? Kroeber, Boas, Linton, Lowy, these people. Did any of them?
Well, I knew many of them, but No, Benedict had a big influence on me. I think I liked, because she brought an aesthetic approach to anthropology, which I...
Did you know Robert Lowe?
Yeah, I knew Robert Lowe. In fact, he was partly, I think, responsible for me for coming to Berkeley. I had met him when he came to talk. I didn't know him that well, but I met him when he came to talk at Harvard, and I was head of the student speakers thing, and so I had him for a day and so on. And he was one who brought me to Berkeley, and before I went there, I went to the field in between and so on. And I saw him, and then when I got back, he was dead, alas. But yeah, I did know Robert Lowe.
I have a huge respect for him. I like his work enormously. Was he a nice man as well? Or?
Yeah, mine's the other way around. His work has not had much impact on me. The crow bores me, but that's just me. But I mean, but as a man, he was, yes. Again, I don't want to claim I knew him that well, but he was a very fine person. Kober I knew because when I went to Harvard, though I didn't meet him then, Kober and Kluckholm were doing that culture book, and I was a research assistant on it. I mean, comment. And then later when I was at Berkeley, Kober was living, he was then retired, in fact, not too long from death, living up in the hills. And when I left, he called me up, and we had a long discussion about why I was leaving Berkeley after only a year, going to 2 years, but only 1 year there, to go to Chicago. And he was very nice, very well. But that's all I know of him. I mean, the relationship was formal, but pleasant. I mean, certainly he was, he wanted me to stay, but he said, I could understand why you might want to go. So I met Linton once or twice when he talked at Harvard. Clark knew all these people, so we got to meet them all one way or another. But I can't say I knew Linton. I admired, of course, Sapir enormously, who was influential, but never met him. Sapir has had a big influence earlier on. And that's through Klein. Sapir and Benedict and so on, that whole notion of mean is important. Whatever the shortcomings of some of the work is still, that. Boas, of course, was dead before I came into the field, so I didn't have any relation to Boas. But and I guess when I first came in, there was a feeling in the air, which was quite wrong, that Boas was, well, that he was all about fish recipes, and so that he was the ultimate data gatherer, which isn't correct, actually. He was a much deeper thinker than that, but it took a while, and George Stockey and a few other people before we understood that. So I think I shared the cliche, not out of reading him much. I had read Primitive Man and Art, whatever it's called, or some others. But I had a general, yes, that he was about fish hooks and so on, and my interest in fish hooks was limited. Oh, sorry.
Returning to your PhD work, you enrolled, and how was it that you came to start your work in Indonesia?
Well, everything, by the time this is over, you're going to feel that my life is a continual chance of lucky breaks, but it's true. Hilly and I were studying at Harvard, and working very hard for 2 years at Harvard. You worked extremely hard. I didn't do anything but study. And we were thinking vaguely, Fieldwork was a destiny. It was going to happen. Those days it was a rite de passage. There was no question, and had to be out of the United States, another language. I mean, there was no. That's no longer the case, alas, in my view. But whatever that's, I suppose. But anyway, I didn't know what I thought. Well, vaguely, I might go to Brazil, but that was just it's there. So I'm walking across the Harvard Yard one day, and Doug Oliver, an anthropologist teaching at Peabody, comes up to me and says, "Well, we have this group project that's going to Java for 2 years or 3 years, whatever it was, and we need somebody to study kinship and somebody to study religion. Would you and your wife be willing to do this?" And I said, essentially, there's not no quotation, but I said, "Yes, where is Indonesia?" I had never thought of it, heard of it. It was extremely well financed. Those were the days when things were well financed. Ford Foundation was financing it. And we had, so I joined the group. There were 8 of us, I think, to start. Only about 5 I managed to make it to the field, or 7 or 4 or 5. 8 or 9 to start. And we had language training every weekend, for the whole weekend, oral with this Diane, who was then the leading Malayo-Polynesian linguist, and then later on Rufus Hendon, who is now the leading American linguist. So so I said, if we studied that language for a year, then went off to Java. But it was just, the finger of God. I mean, it had no. Now again, it was Clyde's doing. I mean, Clyde had organized this, and he had said, "Oliver, go get those kids." I mean, so that's why again I am very positive about Clyde, even though my personal relationships with him were not the happy ones. But he was very good to me, and so that's how it happened.
What about that famous moment as you step onto the beach in, as it were, the Trobriands, and your first impressions as you arrive in Indonesia? Can you remember that?
Well, I remember them very vividly because I went to Holland for 2 or 3 months before I went to learn Dutch, to improve my Dutch reading ability and to learn to speak it a bit, but mainly to read it, and to meet some Dutch scholars, half of whom would talk to me and half of whom wouldn't, because that was the time when they thought America was stealing their empire. But anyway, never mind that. And some of them were very, very kind to me. So anyway, I lived in Leiden for quite a while, 3 or 4 months. Then got on a ship with all of his gunners. The rest came by later. Hilly too was in Leiden. We went on a ship, the Willem Rouse, which took a month to get to Indonesia. The day before we arrived, the first coup d'etat rebellion against Sukarno government broke out, and it was an hour run thing. It's called October 17th or 17th? I think that's right. And so when we arrived, there were tanks in the streets, and we had some friends. We had already been Indonesian friends who were socialists, a member of Shahrir Socialist Party. I know this is ancient history. For Indonesians know this history, but nobody else will. But anyway, Shahrir was one of the first prime ministers, was a UN resident. And I didn't know him particularly, but I did know Sujat Moko, who was his right-hand man, a younger guy. So these socialists took us, especially Hilly and I, and put us in a sort of safe house of socialists. It wasn't clear whether the socialists were all going to go to jail because they were on the wrong side of this rebellion. It was very tense for 3 or 4 days. So I entered it, at the first, right in the middle of a coup d'etat, or attempted one. It was eventually, Sukarno finally gave one of his famous performances in front of the parliament, gave a speech and talked the people out of their, essentially talked them out of the coup d'etat. And the socialists escaped without much damage, even though they were still was early on days. Later on, they had more harder time. So we came out of hiding. We didn't know for 2 or 3 days whether we were going to be arrested, whether we were going to be shot, or whether we were going to be thrown out of the country. And we didn't really know what was going on because we couldn't leave the house, essentially. And there were millions of rumors and a lot of socialist conspirators coming back and forth. It was in the house of a man named Sam Udin, who's now forgotten, but who was a very important politician at that time, socialist politician. So yeah, I do remember putting my feet on the beach, and then it then cleared up, and we then went to live downtown, and things were...
there was a certain amount of chaos because your leader decided not to come with you.
Yeah, that's a different side.
And you were sent off. You were going to be sent off to some remote hotel somewhere.
Right. Well, this is a little later now. Okay, so now I'm now on the beach or whatever. So we go to Yogyakarta. Yes, that's what Douglas Oliver had organized the thing. Clyde, as they say, was the real entrepreneur behind it all and set it all up. But Doug Oliver had gone to Jogja, it's in Central Java, in Palestine, where there was the new National University had just been founded. It was founded in the Sultan's Palace. Beautiful town. It's a beautiful town and a beautiful place at that time. I still remember it with extraordinary nostalgia. I can really get nostalgic about it. But the thing is, yes, I can't think, it was more than a week or 2 before we left. Memory is not certain, but it wasn't long before we left that he suddenly said he had some sort of mysterious illness and he wasn't going to go. And of course, he had made an arrangement. As I say, he had hardly told. He intimated a few of it. By and large, except that we were going to work with Gajah, they were going to be students. It wasn't very clear what was going to go on. But there were 3 professors, nationalists. I mean, this is in the middle of the nationalist revolution, who they're not trustful of foreigners. I mean, especially of, I remember the first thing one of the professors said to me, I said something, he was asking, I was still a kid, and he said, what kind of your methodology? And I said, I'm essentially an empiricist. And he said, made some wisecrack about what's the difference between an empiricist and an imperialist. So we were off on a right foot, though later he became very nice. There were these 3 professors, quite different characters, and they were it had been set up. There were going to be about 30 students from Gajah Mada the university. That's the name of the university. And of course, this was all new, and they had no, these students were not students. I mean, they were students, but they really knew nothing. They didn't claim to. I can't claim that. I mean, but they were going to learn from us. That was the idea. But we were going to have these 30 students. We were all going to go up and sit in a hotel in an old sort of watering hole, because it's one of the few places in Java that doesn't grow rice. I mean, it's that high up. It's a rather beautiful place, and it's interesting in itself. But we were going to sit in this hotel, and the government officials were going to bring in people for us to interview in company with these students in a kind of mass interview situation. This is the way the Adat law tradition people in Holland and many Dutch anthropologists had worked. They went and the village chief called in people, and they asked them questions about, what do you call your brother, what do you call your cross cousin, what do you do, what happens at marriage, and so on. And you wrote it all down and you published it in books. Well, this was about as antithetical to everything we've been trained. Participant observation was what we've been trained to do. The anthropologist is sort of one of them, right in the middle of it. The sort of lone, the Malinowskian image. It couldn't have been further from what we had in mind. And we simply weren't going to do this. I mean, very early on we thought this was ruinous. But in addition to that, of course, they suspected that Oliver's not coming was a plot of some sort, that he really had never attempted to keep his side of the bargain. And they were deeply suspicious. They said, what do you know, you may come out here with this full Harvard professor, and you're going to do this marvel thing, and you send us a bunch of graduate students. I was almost the oldest. No, Ed Ryan was the oldest, but they were... So we did the best we could, this was 8 months of this, of our trying to get disentangled from that situation, without a leader, without any status. And eventually they said Rufus Hennon was great, but Rufus also at that time was not a major figure. I mean, he was at least a faculty member, which is a little step up, but that he was a young, I think he may have been only an assistant professor or associate professor. Anyway, he was not a major figure. But he did very well. But he came later, and then it finally did. I've written about how this all happened. Don Fagg, myself, Hilly, and Ed Ryan just got in. We had a car that was provided to us, and just rode all over eastern Java, east central Java, trying to find a town that we could work in. We found one where there was a very fine local. The key to anthropology fieldwork is who's in charge locally, as you know. I mean, if you could, especially in a place like Indonesia, if the district officer, if he wants you there, and this guy was great. He was an old nationalist. He really thought this was a great idea, that Americans would understand it. I mean, he had it all right, and he understood we wanted to live with families. He set it up. So that's what made us decide to go there. There were some others that were Barre, this is Barre.
And they thought another 2,000 or 3,000 of you were coming shortly.
No, that's just a rumor. No, I don't think that most of them did. But I had some, later when we talked, some people said, I think there's going to be 1,000 of you. And I said, no, there's just 5 or 6 of us. And, and then we were distributed around the area, and we worked there for 2 years, 2.5 years. And so it all worked out well. We detached ourselves. We didn't have the students. That ended. There was a lot of bitterness felt. And the bitterness, they had right to feel some bitterness. Here they had been deceived in some, not purposely, at least not by me, but so we just worked there, and we got on good relationships, eventually, with these 3 professors, and one of them especially was very supportive. Another one was also sort of, so it all worked out in the end, but it was extremely, when Rufus came, he went to see the culture minister, an Islamic medical figure who was an intense nationalist, who subjected Rufus to about 3 hours of bitter harangue about what faithless Americans were like. But we had it coming in a way. I mean, we as a group, I didn't feel personally had it coming, but we as a group had it coming. And but then in the end he said, essentially, fuck you, go ahead and do it. I mean, the Japanese version of that or whatever, go ahead. Don't bother me again. I don't want to hear of you. If anything happens to you, don't write me. And we went off, and it worked out beautifully. I mean, the years there were marvelous. And so it was the end. And then their relationship with Gajah did smooth out. I mean, they became cordial. And I think, again, looking back, that the professors and the whole apparatus there were just as relieved themselves. They all had gotten in too deep, into something they didn't understand.
You've been back many times.
Oh, many times, yeah.
obviously, what is it about fieldwork? I mean, do you do it because you know it's important to you, or do you do it because you enjoy it, or?
I love it, yeah, I enjoy it. Well, it's important too, but at least I hope it's important. No, I've never been happier than in the field. And not all the time, it's hell much of the time, but yeah, I liked it. Anthropologists lead a very oddly divided life. I guess part of it is a kind of self-proving thing. I would have not thought when I taught, I'm going around circles, but when I taught later, you can't tell when you have students in class whether they're going to be good field workers or not. Some of the brightest can't do it. Some of the least impressive in class can, but it doesn't work that way either. I mean, there's just no correlation between classwork and fieldwork abilities. I mean, sometimes they go together, sometimes they're both bright in class and bright in the field, sometimes they're one or the other, but you cannot predict. I was never able to predict who would become good field workers, nor for myself. And I didn't think that I would be, but I found that I was good at it, or I feel I was good at it. I mean, never mind what the world thinks, but I think that I was good at it. And I liked it. I worked. It's excruciating. It's a tremendous amount of effort and work. But I've always been happier in the field than anywhere else.
So you were, that time, I think it was, certainly one of the times, you were very, very ill.
Yeah, almost died, yeah.
Both of you very ill. There
were different times, yeah, we both.
War going on around you.
Oh, that's later, yeah.
I mean, the conditions sound horrendous, and yet you still went back for more.
Oh, yeah. Well, it goes with the territory. I did go back for more. That was later on. I was sick even the first time I almost died. I had pneumonia and almost died. I stayed in the hospital in Geertz for several months. And then later, yes, that was a later trip. And that was about 10 years further on. I was in the middle of a war, and I had tropical malaria, and also I couldn't see because they had given me
some kind of myopia. Didn't you?
Yeah, it was terrible. And Hilly was practically dying when she had hepatitis. It turned yellow, and we were isolated in this place, and there was no doctors except one German doctor who had been on the Italian front. But anyway, and we fled across, and so, and that story's all. I've told that story in the.
Did you not think in the middle of all that, I'm never going to do any more field work?
No, in a minute, no. As soon as we got back, and then we got back there, and Hilly recovered, and I recovered first, and then Hilly got more or less okay. They invaded us from the sky. We were in an oil camp belonged to American Oil Company. We went there because there was a hospital there, and she could be treated. Took a horrendous trip across the middle of Sumatra. And we got invaded by paratroopers, and then we went back to Bali and finished out. We didn't go home. We went back another 6-7 months to Bali. It interrupted a program I had. I was going to go to Sulawesi and so on, but that was not possible. And I was going to work in Minangkabau, and that wasn't possible either. But no, and then I've been back, yes, as you said, and I worked. Most of the work in Morocco came after that. So I've never thought about not going. I would like to go. Now, the last time I was back was about 3 years ago. I was back for only then about 6 weeks or something. But I went all over the place, and yeah, I still like it. I would do it if I thought I would survive. I'm not so sure I would survive now.
I'm sure you would, but what is it? Is it curiosity? Is it the relaxing of the relations that you have in your own society? Many anthropologists find a great sense of relief.
No, I mean maybe do, but that isn't. It's what it is finding out about finding out how people are really quite different than you are, what they're all about. I find that an absolutely intriguing thing to do, to figure out what the hell is going on with these people. What the hell is happening here? How this works? And the Japanese and the Balinese and the Moroccans are to me endlessly intriguing. I mean, it's the kind of. I'm not, I have a reputation of not being a very scientifically oriented anthropologist. I'm not a hard scientist type, but in that regard, I am. I really am I want to know what this. So I have the same kind of puzzlement that a physicist would have about. Why some phenomena go about stars or something. I mean, I want to understand them. My main motives are radically cognitive. I wouldn't put it that way because I don't like the idea of cognitive even that way, but they are to interpret and understand these, and I enjoy that. I enjoy just figuring them out and figuring out how to get along with them and figuring out how to live with them and figuring out what makes them tick. I just find that extraordinary. and being allowed to do it without anybody telling me how to do it. That's the other thing you do have in the field. You're your own person, and you can do what you want. I mean, there are constraints, so millions of constraints, but they're not the constraints of professors and courses and so I just find it endlessly fascinating. I find the Javanese and the Balinese and the Moroccans, the three groups I worked with, endlessly. I could spend the rest of my life just trying to figure out what the hell they're all about.
Was that, I mean, you started in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So were there any larger questions? I mean, the earlier generations of anthropologists were trying to find out whether there was a common humanity or, you know, very general questions about human nature and human progress and so on. Behind the curiosity of trying to find out what they were about and understanding them, were there some more general questions, do you think?
Well, you see in the phrase lecture I'm about to give, I come to talk about meaning a bit, but I really, yes, I was asked general questions about how people construct meaningful lives, but again, I'm a fox, not a hedgehog, so I don't think that there's a single kind of underlying. I've always been opposed. I've always been pluralist. I assume people really are different. I mean, not radically different. If they wouldn't, could talk to each other. I don't want to get the relativism arguments, but I think I do really think Javanese are not just a different version of Americans. I mean, I think they're very profoundly themselves, or Moroccans or Balinese. So I'm not looking for common humanity in that sense. Sure, there's common humanity. We're all human beings. But I'm looking for the specific particular expressions of it. Again, I start off in literature. I'm interested in specific expression. I'm interested in the, you know, when you study literature, you're not interested, well, at least the way I study it, you're not interested in some sort of general notion of what literature is. You're interested in, you know, Dickens and Shakespeare and Emily Dickinson and in my case, and Hawthorne and people. What is specific and special and extraordinary about these people? So I'm more like that. So I'm not looking for some sort of abstract common humanity. I'm not denying people are human, and that's certainly true. But I'm more interested in the Javanese, the Javaneseness of the Javanese, and the Moroccaness of the Moroccans, and the Americanness of myself. That's what concerns me, and I'm trying to puzzle it out. I'm interested in people's ways of being in the world, to use a Heideggerian phrase, which is now, I think is the right way to put it. I mean, I think that's what, or a form of life in Wittgenstein's sense. I'm interested in exactly, and I'm interested in those in the way in which anyone interested in diversity, the way Darwin was interested in species or animals, about what they are really like. Now, it doesn't mean you don't want some general notions. I do. I've tried to make some general arguments. But I'm not an Enlightenment figure that's trying to figure out what people are like underneath it all. I want to find out what they're like within it all. I don't know if that makes any sense. But
it does. We'll come back to it, but just one last question along those lines. I mean, I think Edmund Leach and also Keith Thomas have both said that the only point of history or anthropology in those two cases is really as a mirror of your own society. In other words, it'll tell you something about your own world and make you better in your own world. Not taking it to that extreme, did you ever feel that this might also help you to understand America? Oh,
it certainly helps you to understand yourself. And America, I don't agree with that position, however. That's exactly what we're not supposed to be doing. Yeah. I'm not studying Javanese in the service of understanding the United States. I'm studying the Javanese to understand the Javanese. So I don't agree with, Keith is a very good friend of mine, but I don't agree with that. I mean, Keith Hopkins or Keith Thomas? We'll get mixed together. Keith Thomas, yeah. So I think it does, but I think we do really want to understand the other as the other, not as just a pale reflection of us or as a way of into our own selves. I think that's more narcissistic than I care to be. Which doesn't mean you don't learn anything about the United States by being abroad. Of course you do, and it's changed my views of all kinds of things. But I went to Java and Morocco and Bali to understand Java and Morocco and Bali, not to understand the United States.
So, Clifford, part two. We've got you to Indonesia, and we've got you through your PhD. So should we move on from Harvard to Berkeley very briefly, or?
Sure. I actually was very briefly at Berkeley. After Harvard, I worked a little while at MIT in the Center for National Studies, and went back to Indonesia to do a study of. That's when I got caught in that war I was just talking about. it ended up with a year in Bali. It was originally planned to be 3 different places, but that didn't turn out to be practical. So then I came back and spent a year at Palo Alto at that think tank there, and had a job at Berkeley, and went and taught at Berkeley for a year. That's about the only time almost in my life that I've been fully enclosed in an anthropology department. Worked very hard, taught a lot of courses, large classes. They were very kind to me, but I was a young assistant professor and you get a lot of work. And the anthropology department in itself was larger than I think my college had been that I'd gone to, my undergraduate college. So so I was just there for a year. I enjoyed it, and it was just before it was just prior to the outbreak of the Berkeley rebellions. And actually, that was the year that the House Un-American Activities Committee came to San Francisco, to the City Hall. My father's, not that he's connected to any of this, but he was city engineer of San Francisco, so his office was in City Hall. So I knew the City Hall very well. Anyway, the first day the kids went over there to protest. This is prehistory of the Berkeley revolt. And I don't know, they got washed down or something, I don't remember. So they came to me and Tom Fowlers and some other people, younger anthropologists, and said, we want you to come over and just stand there and witness it. So if they do anything horrible, we've got real professors to say that this is what happened. Oh, I did, and nothing happened. But anyway, that was the period. And then when Edward Shills and David Apter, who were forming at Chicago, were forming a committee for comparative study of new nations, and asked me to join them, and it would be actually almost full-time on them. I was involved in the anthropology department too, but I didn't have much to do there. I jumped at it because I wanted to get back to research, to my work, and I was, so I went. So the year at Berkeley was just a year of, as I remembered, of teaching from one year to the other, but I enjoyed it. It was a nice place.
Do you like teaching?
Not much, no. I should amend that bit. I don't like lecturing. I mean, I don't mind teaching. I like to teach seminars. And I like to work with students. In that sense, I like teaching. But I do not like teaching 20 lecture courses and so on. I mean, that's not my idea of happiness. No, I don't. That exhausts me because I work very hard on them and so on. And I certainly have avoided it, so I must not like it.
What about administration?
I've never done it. I've avoided that. In fact, one of the reasons I finally left Chicago wasn't the main reason, but one of the considerations 10 years on, after I was there 10 years, was that I was going to end up chairman of that department if I didn't watch it, because it was coming around. You know, these things come around like fatalities. And I didn't look forward to that idea. No, I don't like administration. I've never done any. I did run the committee for comparative study of nations eventually. I became chairman of it and so on, but it was a minor administrative role. I mean, I didn't take it. It was all friends, and it was a small group, and it was pretty much on its own. But no, I've never done and of course at the Institute I set up the school and got it started and ran it, but again, it's different kind of, but administration of a sort of dean level sort of, no, I never, and that, I don't, no aspirations, but would die rather than do it, I think.
When you went to Chicago, you mentioned the 2 people who were finding Ed Shills,
David Apter.
David Apter. What about them? I met David, I think, many years ago.
Yeah, he's still around. David and I were at Antioch together, so I knew him. And he was at the Palo Alto Center when I was there. So we re-met. We knew each other in between as well, because he'd been working in Africa. He's a political scientist, very well-known political scientist. He had worked in, he wrote a very good book on the Gold Coast, on Ghana and transition, originally Gold Coast, then Ghana and transition. Worked in Uganda. Anyway, he's done a lot of it. He worked in Japan. You may know he's working in Japan. In China. Anyway, he was an old friend, and he was at the center at Palo Alto, and Edward was. Now, I didn't know Edward before that, though Edward had been involved with Talcott on that project, but I didn't know him then. I met him at Palo Alto. So they were setting this thing up. They planned it, I think, essentially while they were at Palo Alto, and asked me then whether if they could set it up, they got money from Carnegie eventually to do it, whether I would be interested. And I said, yeah, I would be. And so about halfway along in the year at Berkeley, I got this invitation if that I could join them as in the anthropology department, and the 3 anthropologists left Berkeley at one time, as you may know, to go to Chicago. It was a sort of, it was a scandal, but it wasn't real. It just was an accident, I think. But David Schneider, myself, and Tom Fowlers, who were all close friends. We all knew each other very, very well. I, of course, known David for years. I've known him since Harvard.
I'm going to be interviewing Tom Fowlers, I think.
Tom Fowlers dead.
He's dead. Oh, well, who is it? Some East Africanist. I thought it was Fowlers. Oh, well. Anyway.
It won't be him.
No, it won't.
He died some years ago. But anyway, Tom and I and David all left Berkeley that year to go to Chicago. And the Chicago department was somewhat transformed. It was an odd situation because it was the most benevolent sort of ruling class I've ever encountered. Fred Hagen and Saltax and a number of other people, Don McClown. They really wanted us to change the place. And so, not just, me, and later on Vic Turner joined us. There was all kinds of people. Kim Marriott and Milton Singer was there. It was also one of the benevolent elders. So we had a tremendous thing in the department. And then most of my time, though, actually, was spent in the committee. The committee had fellows. We brought people for a year, and we had a seminar, met once a week, and published things and said things of that sort. So I was more or less in charge of that. I was a secretary for a long time, then the chairman of it. And I also, that was the period when I began to work in Morocco. So I got some graduate students.
How did you're going to Morocco? It was really because you couldn't go back to...
And for the moment I couldn't go back to Indonesia, that's right. I had 2 young children, and I just didn't feel it. I might have gone myself, but I didn't think I would go with them.
And you cast around for all sorts of places like Bengal.
Yeah. I thought seriously about Bengal, working on both sides of the border and so on, but I think that would have been a disaster, but I never got very... I got to start even to learn some...
How did Morocco come up?
Yeah, well, that's the story, because I was here in Cambridge. And that's the famous Cambridge Hands Across the Sea thing, which I'll mention again tomorrow when I talk. I mentioned to somebody, and I can't remember who it was, but I just any longer know. And they said, well, why don't you think about Morocco? Morocco's Islamic, and it's peaceful, and you can work there. It wasn't somebody who had worked there, but at least didn't know about it.
It wasn't Ernest Gellner, or...
No, it wasn't Ernest. No, I didn't know Ernest in those days, so it wasn't him. No, it wasn't anybody very prominent, or I would remember them, I think. But God bless them, whoever they were. So instead of going home after the meeting...
This is 1963, the ASA...
You're right, the famous, sort of Hands Across the Sea business. So I just said, instead of going back to Chicago directly, I went to Morocco, hired a Peugeot, and for about 6 weeks drove over the whole country, which you can, especially if you drive 80 miles an hour on those roads, and visited almost every small town in Morocco and decided, yes, I wanted to do this. And then got the money and arranged it. And then went back 3 or 4 times during the time I was in Chicago. I gathered a number of students, and we did a chainmail. Rather than like the PARI thing, the Java thing, we were all there together. But in this one, I went, and then I brought a student who came when I was still there for about a month or so, and then I came back when he was only a month to go, and I had several students do that. So we covered the town almost continuously for almost a decade. I mean, I have to look back at the exact dates, but it was a chainmail thing. I went back 3 or 4 times. After each student I went, and before each student I went, and worked on. I'm still going back since. But did all that while I was in Chicago. So I was only in Chicago half the time anyway, and when I was half the time there, was only half the time in the department. So it was, as I said, I've gotten away with a lot in my day.
You commented that this kind of backwards and forwards comparison, some similarities, Islam and so on, peripheral, etc., but also a huge difference. There's a great advantage.
Yeah, I thought, I sometimes think of that. If I'd have stayed in Indonesia all the time, I would have thought always Indonesia as the sort of third world country, or the other, as they now say. Going to Morocco disabused me of that, gave me a kind of sense of the variousness of it, which then extends to an understanding of how much variousness there is across the whole board. So I think I learned more about Java going to Morocco than I would have by going back directly to Java, because everything then becomes in a kind of counter relief. And yet I've played this thing back and forth all the time. not a play on something uncontrolled comparison. It's just trying to get comparing incomparables to try to see how they match. So you can see, and it keeps you from also seeing, again, the society you're studying, Java or Morocco, entirely through the lens of Americans. You at least have a triangulation. Yes. You see Morocco in terms of Indonesia, Indonesia in terms of Morocco, and you can play that off in a way that at least a bit defamiliarizes you and a bit deprovincializes you. So you don't always have, which I think is implicit and inevitable in any kind of anthropological work, is always the we-they sort of thing you were talking about. Keith Thomas, I don't think it's only we were interested in, but I don't hold that. But I certainly would agree that there's always that implicit comparison, whether it's explicit or explicit, there's always that sense. And I think having a third term in it helps a lot to see that it's not just the difference between Morocco and America, or Indonesia and America, but between Morocco and Indonesia. That helps a lot. I found it very liberating, and I think it was if it was an accident, it was a very lucky one.
Comparing them, one of the things that you thought at first, certainly from the language, was that Morocco was all about gender, and Indonesia was all about hierarchy. Yeah. But then you decided that it really wasn't quite like that.
Well, I think there is that difference, but I don't know that, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. I do think that you can't sum up complex societies in glib ways of that sort. I do think that the gender hierarchy contrast still does tell you a lot about the difference between Indonesia and Morocco. But obviously I was interested in all kinds of other things as well, and that didn't play. I'm not quite sure what you're driving at, because I did start with that. It came up in linguistic study. If you study the languages, when I studied Javanese, people always corrected hierarchy mistakes. It's Javanese, as you know, is stratified. I mean, it's even more than Japanese. It's very, very stratified. And so if you make any kind of but they didn't care. In fact, most things weren't marked for gender, and when they were marked, they didn't give a damn. Whereas in Morocco, there's no marking for hierarchy in the language, or essentially none. It's Arabic. I mean, it doesn't have that kind of stuff. But any gender mistake was immediately corrected. So that gave a kind of way into trying to begin to look at the two societies. But I wasn't trying to sum up the whole two societies in terms of their languages.
There was another contrast you made. One was about, I don't know how you pronounce it, Sedek.
Sedek, yeah.
Sedek, which was about honor and trust and so on. And that was Morocco, wasn't it?
Mm.
And in Indonesia, it was about what, communities, was it? Or?
No, more I think probably rasa, but not necessarily Italian, but a sense of feeling, meaning, intuitive, sort of. Yeah, Sedek means it's a little, I had a whole range of terms on both sides. It wasn't just one term, but it was a whole set of terms. Morocco is kind of moralistic. It's about loyalty. It's about strength. It's about directness, so on. Java, it's about hierarchy, about subtlety, about difference, and about feeling meaning. Rasa is a very hard term to translate. So Sedek, hard term to translate. So yeah, I tried to do that a bit. I later did the whole string of Arabic terms in the book I did on the souk, on the market, trying to show how these terms give you a sense of what the mentality of a marketplace bazaar is in Morocco. But yeah, those were I tried to use terms like that to use as an axis of trying to get at broader differences and similarities.
Well, coming back to your progression through universities, did you move on from Chicago to Princeton?
Yeah, I was asked earlier on to go, and I said no. Eventually, I thought about it a lot, but I said no. But then I thought about it again, and back when I was back in the field again in Morocco, I wrote to Carl Case and said, well, maybe I would be interested if you're still interested. And he said yes. Now, what they were doing, the Institute for Advanced Study was set up in the 30s to bring Einstein, a number of people.
Von Neumann was later.
Von Neumann was a bit later, but he's also one of them. But I was trying to think of the mathematician. The famous mathematician. Well, Gödel was there. Gödel I knew. Einstein was dead by the time I got so was von Neumann, but I did know Gödel. There's another one. But anyway, they were bringing all these people from Europe, and it was set up as the first of these sort of advanced study places where it was wholly research, and you bring people there. Now they had, by the time I was asked to join them, which was 35 years ago, 1970, there were 3 schools that had evolved into this. Originally it was rather diffused, then it became formed. A natural science school, which is essentially physics and astrophysics. A school of mathematics, which is the largest and probably the most famous mathematics school in the world. Certainly was then, anyway. It still probably is. And a history school, which is mostly, well, there is one modern historian, but mainly it's then was anyway, classical history and medieval history and very early modern history. And when Oppenheimer, who had been Robert Oppenheimer was director at the Institute, died, he was replaced by Carl Kazin, an economist from Harvard, whom I don't to this day know whether I ever met Carl while he was at Harvard, but I certainly didn't know him well. I knew of him, we knew of each other perhaps, but anyway, he, again at the advice I think of Edward Shills probably, decided, well, first he decided, that advice of Edward Shills was this, he decided he wanted to have a social science school. He came on that, they were going to set up a 4th school of social science, and on the advice of Edward Shills, he invited me to be the first member of it, to start it up. And I was then appointed. So I went, and the rest is rather checkered history.
You do talk about, I mean, not only about the Bella dispute and so on, but you imply also that even after that was settled, the whole relationship in Princeton was rather tense.
It was always dicey, yeah. It's not now so much, but it was up until very recently, yes. Well, there were a couple of other appointments which were blocked. And there was a constant attempt. In the early days, I think we were living under the business of, was this thing going to really succeed or not? So it was our eternal vigilance as a place of liberty, and that's the way it was. And the hostility, not there anymore now, I might say. I think, there may be some, but there's nothing like what it was. There was a determination to drive the school out, and to drive the director out. They did drive the director out. Carl finally quit. Went back to Harvard. So it was touch and go for a long time. After the next thing after the Bella affair and Bella's departure, so that didn't take. There was an attempt also to appoint George Miller, psycholinguistics, but Carl didn't have the money for that, and they wouldn't let him do that either. They were opposed to that. But on my side, I then asked Albert Hirschman, who had been there and whom I knew, to join, and he had all the languages and the status and so on. So there wasn't much. By then, this whole crisis had embarrassed them, and some of the wiser heads in the other schools said, "This has got to stop. We can't be in the New York Times every day with this scandal. It's not in our interest to do this anymore, and we don't have to drive them out. We can absorb them or deal with it," and so on. So some of the better people, some very nice people in mathematics and so on, I got together an ad hoc committee to get Albert to come. So once Albert was there was then he and I, and then a few years later we brought Michael Walzer, and then eventually Joan Scott. In between there were some missed opportunities. I don't know how much it took. We tried to bring Bruno Latour, and there was a revolt against that. And we just couldn't get we got the ad hoc committee to support it. We got everybody supported, but the board of trustees wouldn't do it because some of the major figures in the other schools said they would resign if he were brought. So that didn't happen. And then another one was blocked. But by and large now it's there for keeps, and it goes along, rocks along more or less on some basis. But it was, and for several years, of course, in the beginning I was there by myself, and Carl had left, and it was just me. And it was a difficult business, and as I say, it was exhausting. When you say administrative, I know this was administrative, but it was academic politics certainly, like I've never seen, and we survived it, and the school now, of course, is for keeps, and there are 4 of us who are about to make a couple more appointments, or they're about to make a couple more appointments. I'm not retired, at least formally, and we bring 20 or 30 people a year, and so it's now. And it's now an accepted part of the Institute, along with the other schools.
Turning perhaps now, since we've got your last resting place, to some of your ideas and influences and methods. You liken anthropology, you say that there isn't really an anthropological method, it's more a journey which you've gone on. And I think last night you said that above all, to understand your work, you'd have to understand the contexts of the people who you were talking to at the time.
Yeah.
Is that right?
No, that is right. The students who were last night were asking me, who did I think I was writing for? And I was saying that really isn't as determined. I have a vague idea of an audience, but I don't have a very clear notion of who I'm writing for, except intelligent laymen of one sort or another, intelligent people of one sort or another. But I do have, I think you can see that if you look at my work, who I was among at the time I was doing this thing, whether it was the people who were at Harvard and sociology department, or the MIT people during the developmental phase, or whether it was Committee of Study of New Nations. Those sort of, you can, I think, or sociology department. So you can then, I think, begin to see the kinds of forces, and then later, of course, at the Institute, the kind of forces that were playing on me. And that's probably a better way. Certainly, it's a better way for me to try to understand why I did and why I did the things I did, and why I made the choices I made.
Reference group theory would be the best way.
I suppose, yeah. Except the reference groups keep changing, but yeah, sure.
One thing that perhaps above all you're famous for is making this shift from the kind of anthropology which I was trained in, which you went out and you studied social structures and supposed facts on the ground, to the study of interpretations of meanings. What do you think led to that? Was it your literary background?
Yeah, I think again I keep trying to stress how little as a professional anthropologist in some sense I am. I don't mean I'm an amateur, but I came into the field never having had any anthropology. My formation was as I wanted to be a novelist, a writer. I had been in English, I'd been in philosophy. When I got to Harvard, the first thing I got involved in was the culture book and so on. I was just always concerned with the relationship to ideas, to life, to behavior, and philosophically oriented. So I objected earlier, just to sometimes being stereotyped by the social relations experience. It had a major effect on me, it was one of those contexts we were talking about, and it was a real one. But I was already pretty well formed by the time I arrived there. So my interest in worldview, in how people, the ways of being in the world, how people live, what they're all about, what they think life is all about, how what they think determines what they do, and how it affects everything from politics to economics to the whole business. I came with that to anthropology. I learned a hell of a lot about how to do it in anthropology, but I came with that sort of a set. So I'll tell you a funny story, because I didn't know any anthropology at all, hardly, when I arrived. When Hilly and I got to, Hilly's my wife, my first wife, we got to Harvard, and I said, well, maybe I better find out what this is all about. So I went into Widener, which is the largest university library, maybe in the world, but certainly in the United States. And I just went into the anthropology section and at random took one book off the shelf to see what it was. I told this once to the author of it. He didn't think it was very funny, but it was George Peter Murdoch's Social Structure, which, as you may know, is a quantitative study of social structural forms. And I went back to Ellie and I said, we've made a tremendous mistake. Nothing could be more antipathetic to my temperament. People should do that. I'm not trying to stop it, but the notion that I would go into to be concerned with such matters it was exactly what I thought was wrong with the world. And, it turned out, of course, that it wasn't representative, and it certainly wasn't representative even of what was going on at Harvard. That's, again, you were talking about Clyde earlier. Clyde was interesting. Clyde had a philosophical background as well, and was concerned with the world. He wrote these books on pattern and the influence of Sapir and so on. So it was, in a sense, that part of the socialization thing was fertile ground or a natural environment for me. But I brought that kind of orientation to anthropology. I didn't think I got it from it. Then, of course, getting involved with anthropology had a tremendous effect on how it worked out and my ideas and so on. But I would have never, if anthropology had really stayed in a hard social structure, I'd probably go into something, I'd probably drifted away into social thought or something. I don't know, but because that's just not for me.
In a way, as you mentioned last night, the unintended consequences of your work stretch well beyond what you can ever predict or control.
It's true for everybody.
Because you happen to be at a time when all these other changes which you mentioned, like decolonialization, the lack of loss of self-confidence and so on, simultaneously with your work meant that you became a kind of banner bearer for a new kind of anthropology which was deeply loathed and attacked by many people. But you remain rather surprised that there was such vehemence.
Yeah, I guess so. I still don't quite understand it. I had no program to take over anthropology. I had no desire to do anything except my work, and I still don't. I mean, I never have. You're talking about administrative thing. I've always gone away from building houses for other people to live in. I'm not interested in doing that. I'm not interested. The one little project design was the Morocco thing, and that was pretty invertebrate. I mean, students did what they wanted. So I've never been, and I've not occupied positions of power. I've stayed mainly outside the anthropology bureaucracy in the United States, and not been involved in the association affairs very much, hardly at all. Never been a dean of anything or a chair, and I'm not even in a formal department. So I don't quite know why they're so frightened. I just do my work. And hope that it has its influence, but I guess it did threaten some people, perhaps still does. That's too damn bad. I mean, I don't know, but I wasn't out to do anything except my work. I never have. I've not tried to set up a school. The School of Social Science at the Institute is not a marching society. I'm the only anthropologist there. We didn't bring any more there. And if you know the people who were there, Hirschman and Walser and Scott, whatever they are, they're certainly not replicas of me. I mean, they're sympathetic to opener. It's true, I'm not likely to choose people who are very narrowly focused. But beyond that, our elective affinities are very broad in general. So, I guess I was a little surprised by it. But as I had no particular ambitions in those directions anyway, I didn't worry about it very much. I think, I don't know. I really don't know why.
If someone said to you, well, what you did was basically destroyed an external reality, that there were no longer facts, everything was constructed.
That's nonsense.
Well, I want you to say that.
No, of course I don't think there's no external. I think the conception of facts that some of these people have is rather one-dimensional, and their view of the world is rather one-dimensional. But the notion that there are no facts, I never said anything like that. My thesis was 700 pages long, and whatever it has lots of data. Some of it may be true. Correct. But I've never done that. I'm very ethnographic. I've always been that. I just, I report fine detail about the Moroccan.
4,000 pages of field notes.
Yes, I do have more than that. I think 5,000 or 6,000, and a lot of it gets into the work. So it isn't that I don't pay. And so the notion, this is a kind of, there is a fear of
subjectivity.
Panic fear, yeah. And it's the fear of the failure of the Enlightenment project that worries some of them very deeply. And I think the fear is exaggerated myself. They have nothing to be so afraid of. But if they're afraid, they're afraid. But I certainly do not think that there are no facts. I think quite the contrary. The world is very, very real. And I'm trying to understand it. I do think it varies. People vary and differ, and that there are things to learn that you can't learn from your own tradition. And that's another reason why perhaps I have some hostility, because I tend to not to be thinking of the Western tradition as normative. And that by now is almost a commonplace, but when we started out, it was not. We studied them, and I never thought that.
Well, certainly, while not building up an institutional base or a set of disciples, you're probably one of the 2 or 3 anthropologists of the 20th century who have become an adjective. I mean, my students write about the Geertzian, this and that, Demonstration, Geertzian.
Right, yeah.
There are not many.
I got a thing from, I didn't remember, but I got a thing from Mexico recently about who said he was a Geertziano, and he was part of the Geertziano movement. He had the whole business, Geertzianos. Anyway, never mind, yes.
Yes, so it certainly had a...
In fact...
if we can just dot around a few things that have
sure.
interested me. One thing that strikes me about a lot of what you write is a slight sense of disappointment, that you always seem to be, it's rather like people visiting my garden. I always say, well, if only you'd come a week ago, or if you came in 3 weeks, it would be a lovely garden. At the moment, it's just in between, and you portray a sense of that in your fieldwork.
That's interesting, yeah. Well, it's certainly true that I've been to a lot of places that seemed to be in trouble when I got there, and had been. I am a bit of an historical pessimist, which is, I think, probably comes through. The Islamic proverb, there never was a bad year, but a worse one followed. It seems to me I have a slight tendency in that direction to think that things are going to hell in a handcart. But, I mean, I don't, that's not it. General orientation, but I do have that note. I think in my work a kind of odd nostalgia to feeling that all the golden grasshoppers and bees are gone, sort of the Yeatsian line. You know, I do have that sort of, that's the romanticism in me, I suppose. I'm not aware. I wasn't quite aware that it showed through the prose as much as it perhaps does. It's not intended to be there.
Both that you just come in between, so to speak,
yeah.
Also that you're always on the edge. This is
well,
another feature, not only in your academic position, but in the places you study.
Right, I do, and I think that's what anthropology for me consists of, being anthropologist. Yeah, you're always marginal, and you're purposely marginal. I've never believed in going native or feeling that you could really become a Javanese. You're always an American in Java. I mean, not that you try to live the way they live and understand them. But it's a self-delusion to think that you can, well, if you live there for a long time you can, some people have, but by and large anthropologists are always marginal to the societies they're involved in. And yes, I've always been deliberately marginal in life. I don't want to be into something that I can't get out of. And so that's true, and that may lead to some of this note in my work too, is I feel at the edge of things, and I like it at the edge of things. I think you could see things from the edge that are harder to see from the center.
And also between, you have a phrase, something like, between the large and the small, or that as a feature of anthropology.
Yeah, well, that's recent. You see, again, you were talking about what is definitive of my career in a way is that I came in just at the time when it was anthropology no longer was going to New Guinea and to Africa and so on. I mean, not that it didn't go on or it shouldn't go on, but where people were going to India and Indonesia, where you can't walk barefoot through those societies. You can't do that. I mean, there's a lot of history to know, there are a lot of historians to deal with, there are a lot of stuff. You really have to, so that you no longer could just study a little place, you know, the Trobriands, and just study the Kula. I'm not there's anything wrong with that, but it's just that it doesn't make any sense in Java. I could have done I suppose, a community study of Pare and just described it and said, well, here's a town in Java. But that's crazy, and when the world is blowing up around it, and there are political parties in the place, and there's a communist party, the largest communist party outside the bloc, and is there. All this is going on. There's no way to isolate the essentially localist focus of anthropology, which I still maintain. That's what I do. I study local places locally. But there's no way to no way you should detach that from general forms. So to be in the middle of, I just gave the Mintz lecture at Michigan. That was at Johns Hopkins, and that's what it was about that transition from being off in a jungle or in some place that was really marginal to the world to being in the middle of history all of a sudden. So you couldn't, it was clear to me very briefly, and I think most of my colleagues of my generation, that at least in those places, that was no longer possible. You couldn't, the Cold War ripped Pari apart. I mean, so you can't make believe that it doesn't. and major kinds of economic changes were going on, which were at the national level. You can't understand it. So it was quite clear to me from the very start that though I was going to study locally, it was in order to understand things that transcended the local and the play between local and general issues, national and transnational issues. By now that's a commonplace, but again, if we're talking 1960s, it was not a commonplace because it was just starting. The PARE project was perhaps almost the first of the people of Puerto Rico at the same time that Stewart started. We're almost the first of those collective things going to major civilizations and so on. Sometimes I've had students come to me and say, you know, I'd like to study. They were especially someone who I know who's done some good work of a rather standard anthropological sort. Wanted to think about Japan, and I said, yeah, fine, but you cannot go barefoot to Japan. You really have to learn the language. You got to learn a lot of history. There are a million people there who know a hell of a lot about it. I've been studying for a long time. That's true. In Indonesia, less so when I went, but now it's the case. But you know, you've got economists there. You got all this stuff, and anthropologists have to find a niche in this thing. There's no longer your own niche. It's not Malinowski, and you study canoe building, and you study yam growing, and you study marriage. You can't do that, and that's just the conditions, the realities of the conditions of work. So if you go to Java in 1951, which is when I did, and you get off the ship, and there's a coup d'etat going on, you know that this is not Zandiland. I'm not putting Zandiland down. This is not what that is. I want to emphasize that watershed quality of the 50s. When you asked earlier why people were so mad at me and so on, I think part of it was that we had begun, anthropology changed. Not that I changed anthropology, that it was no longer going someplace and studying the tribe. I mean, there are people still doing it, and it continues to this day, and it should. But that we had a much different situation. So my whole generation simply couldn't be content with, I don't know what you do with lineage theory. I mean, we had this argument in Morocco about whether lineage theory applies there. That's between Ernest and I and some other people. Leaving aside the substance of that argument, the issue is raised in a place like Morocco that it is going to be raised in among the new era. I mean, it's not the same. You can't isolate the society that way. So that a lot of what we did, but it wasn't just me, that disturbed the old debenture holders was that we were really doing a different kind of work in a different kind of place with different kind of concerns and different kind of constraints. And as I say, you couldn't just walk barefoot. You can't study everything. You can't study canoe building. So you've got to really figure out how, if you're going to study lineage organization in a place like Morocco, you have to notice that there's a king. I mean, and you have to notice that there's large-scale trade, caravan trade. I mean, you can't do it that way. At least I think you can't. And most of, I say, I'm not alone in that. There were a lot of differences in my generation in orientation. But we shared that. All of us who came at that time, who went to India, who went to Nigeria, who went to Indonesia, who went to Morocco, went to wherever they went, and they did go to Japan and China and things of this sort, began to understand that something had to happen to the field because the conditions of work had changed. If you want a Marxist phrase, the material basis of our studies had changed.
When an anthropologist went to somewhere like Japan or India, where there were already many specialists, then all students always ask, well, what can they do that these other people can't do?
Right. Well, I think that my work has been dedicated to showing what that could be. I think anthropologists are the only kind of people who, if they want to, can do the kind of understanding of people's conception of what life is all about and so on that I do. What they can do is they can do particularly locally focused studies that do reflect on the whole, that do get at some of the major themes of society. I think that my own sense is that people like economists and sociologists are often blind to a great deal of what goes on in a place like Japan or China, because they come with extremely Western views, and some of which apply. Let me give you a different example. I worked at MIT, as I told you, in the time of the development phase when all was about to take off. And I worked with economists there, a number of whom I liked very much, and who had worked there. And there was a typical kind of cycle they're highly trained MIT type, Harvard type economists. They would go out to Indonesia, and the first thing they would find out was that the government was a bit different than the kind of government they were used to. So they figured, well, we got to learn a little bit about politics, and so they begin to do that. Then they would find that, well, it's really, this politics is set in a rather complicated society, 300 languages, all of the, this is not New Haven. And then they would begin, after they got that, then they would begin to think, well, they don't really quite see things the way we see them. There is, quote, a culture here, whatever. And at that point, one of two things happen. Well, it's one of three things happened. One, they went back to MIT and built a model of Nebraska's economy. I mean, second, they went overboard and started talking about child training. And they became non-economists, or the best ones really tried to say, what can an economist do in such a strange place, and began talking to people like me. And I talked to them because I learned a lot from them. So I used a lot. Because I say, this is not barefoot place. This has got a complicated economy. What do I know about economic planning and so on? This was going on. So you finally found some highly trained technical economists. Ben Higgins, who was a good friend of mine, is dead now, but he's a very fine man. He and I had a lot, and some other people there at MIT, developed a real conversation where we both had something to say that the other didn't know. They wanted to understand, what is the question that anthropologists can answer if you ask your question more generally, is what is Java like? We can say something about that. I mean, can't say it in some definitive way or summary, but we can at least begin to address that question. What is it about this place? And an economist can ask the kind of question, and we can get a dialogue going where you can have an interchange and be part of a group of people. And that's what an anthropologist can do. He can fit into a division of labor of that sort. Not to become, in the same sense, the economist been studying child training. You don't become an amateur economist. You learn enough economics so that you at least are not illiterate. You can understand what the issues are. But you're doing anthropology, and the economists can learn something about what it's like in a small village nobody but anthropologists know that. I mean, maybe it's changing a little bit now, but it's by and large then they didn't. Because again, it was, you have to think back to the 50s, nothing was much known. I mean, the Dutch had done a good deal of ethnographic research. There was some ethnographic facts, but the sense of what life was like in these places and why these odd things were happening, anthropologists were the only people who had even any idea what was happening. So, and I must say that the best economists and the best sociologists, the best historians were open to listening to that, and the best anthropologists were open to being taught about things beyond their ken. And that changed the whole thing. The whole notion of the lone anthropologist. You say I've been at the edge of the world. Well, I always am at the edge, but I'm always related to other people. I don't think you can just tackle a place with 220 million people and 2,000 years of history and every imperialism known to man, just sort of with your notebook and pencil. That's just crazy. But you can learn things with a notebook and pencil that the guy with his models and figure out the gross national product can't do. So that's what I would argue, and then it can be developed. And I would try to say in my work, that's what I've been trying to do, to tell people something about what this place is like.
When you say what this place is like, and you can learn something, and you can learn something in a particular about the general. At one point, I mean, you've always set your face against the kind of Radcliffe Brownian idea of anthropology as a natural science, and you've also, you say a number of times, which I obviously agree with you, that there are no laws. You can't have any predictive laws out of the basis of anthropology.
Well, I won't find them because I'm looking for them.
On the other hand, you quote, I think it's Kierkegaard, saying that we live into the future and we understand from the past. But that sort of implies that we can learn things from the past, which I think you yourself say something like it helps us to intelligently understand our world and maybe guide us a little.
Of course. I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be any worth doing. It's just the Radcliffe Brownian method, a way of going at trying to understand that I object to, not the notion that you can find out anything general about anything.
But you say at another time, you rather scathingly say something like general laws in the political field, such as power tends to corrupt, or the big fish eat the small fish, empty banalities. So what kind of thing do you find out?
Well, I think you find out. It's hard to do that without being concrete. But you find out what, say, political life and how it goes in Java. The main lines of cleavage that I worked out. I tried to show that at one point how the political lines of cleavage, the ones on which people died and were killed on eventually at a large scale, were in great part reflections of and integrated with long-standing worldview differences, coming from Hindic tradition, coming from Islamic tradition, coming from Malayo-Polynesian outlooks. The entanglement of these gives you some understanding of what politics, again, is about in Indonesia. And it isn't that power tends to corrupt is wrong or isn't helpful, but it doesn't get you very far with trying to understand why the fissions that divided Indonesia, divided Java, and led to 750,000 people being killed and so on, where those come from, where they are. I don't think there's any general. And then if you move to Morocco, it's a different set of divisions and a different sort of thing. So I don't know, maybe I'm stumbling about, but I think that's exactly what I've been trying to do. I tried to show in the Gara book what was peculiar about Balinese sense of political life, what it was like, and therefore try to understand why Balinese now react as they do. But there's no law that comes out of that that I can think of. Maybe someone can derive one, but I haven't, not able to.
But if a young Javanese or Moroccan came up to you and said, look, you've studied our society for a long time, I'm growing up in this society, are there a few things you could tell me in quite a simple way in a short space that would help me? Do you think it would be possible to do that or not?
Well, of course I have, in a sense I've written a lot and it's all in Indonesian, they can read it. No, I wouldn't do that. I would try to teach them how to learn about their own society. I would teach them how they can find out for themselves who they are and what they are.
Give them a fishing rod.
Yeah, more of that. But I also have views, and I share them with Indonesians all the time. They invite me and discuss things, and my work is much discussed, and is in Morocco too. So it isn't that I'm hesitant to say what I think to such people. But I don't have the notion, the patting on the head, here it is, here I'll tell you what your culture is. I think that's rather much. So I wouldn't do that. But I do that. I get my emails full of people, right? Especially nowadays. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? So many of them I don't answer, some I do. But I'm always willing to talk about Java with anybody, or Morocco with anybody, or in Bali with anybody, because it fascinates me, and I'm always to check. And a lot of young people who work with me, I've had assistants at the institute and so on. But I don't have a little red book to give them now. That's true. I don't.
Just as well.
Yeah.
Turning finally just to writing and methodology, one of the many things I like about your work is that you do reflect on the creative side of writing and production of knowledge. But you again seem somewhat dissatisfied. You have a phrase, something like, there seems to be a genre missing in terms of autobiographical accounts of fieldwork. They're never satisfying in a way. Yours are actually much better than most, but what exactly do you mean by that? Well,
yeah, it's less autobiographical, though that would be helpful too if we had some really honest accounts of fieldwork. But I think people tend, again, this goes back to this, argument against the kind of rationalist enlightenment view of things, that it's just a matter of going out and looking and writing it down. We need to be much more self-reflexive about what we're doing. We don't, there is no, again, this comes, I guess, out of my literary background. In literature, there's a whole secondary literature about the way in which novels are made. People talk about how Faulkner writes his novels, how Hemingway's are put together, what George Eliot is all about, not in terms of what their psychology is, but how they write, what this is all about. There's almost none of that in anthropology. There's begun to be a little, and my book is one example, and the writing culture book, some of the things in the writing culture book are that, not all of them. And there's been a little bit of others too, but it still has yet to set in. Almost all book reviews say, in the thing, have very little to say about how books are constructed, how the argument is made, how the language is, there's not the kind of reflection that literary criticism does for literature is absent in anthropology. No, it's not totally absent, but it's damn near. And I think if we want, people are always asking methodological questions, and they want them answered in the wrong way. If we understand how, and this is with the point of the book, how Levi-Strauss puts the text together, how Evans Pritchard puts the text together, how Benedict put it together. Whether I'm right or wrong, literary criticism too is constantly, people argue all the time about whose interpretation of George Eliot is right. No, that's open for grabs. But we don't even begin the conversation. We don't. If one doesn't care for my interpretation of Malinowski, write your own. Now that's fine. But there isn't much of that. That's the genre that's missing. A genre that would be the equivalent of literary criticism, more philosophical commentary in philosophy, of commentary on philosophers, people talking about not just doing Wittgenstein, but commenting on what Wittgenstein was doing. We have very little of that, very, very little. We seem to think we know what we're doing, and there are no questions. So we don't really, when you ask me how do I do what I do, I don't know, and I don't know how Evans Pritchard did what he did, and I don't know how Malinowski did what he did either in those terms. I don't say there's no reflection. There's been some, and in recent years there's been more. But that's the genre that's missing, and I would like to see more of it. I would like to see more people think about how anthropological texts are constructed, how they make their arguments, how rhetoric plays into it, the language in which they're cast. There's very little of that. If you look at reviews, they're always the same. X has written this, and this is right and that's wrong, and it's an interesting book, and those who are interested in this thing will be interested in this book, interesting book. And for everyday reviewing, that's all right. I mean, you can't have everything be a great essay. But there are very few good essays on anthropological writers. I mean, there are some now, but there's still very little. And until, I don't just take a date, but before 1960, I'm not sure there were any. I guess there were scattered things here and there, but nobody worried about how Rivers wrote. They were worried about what Rivers had to say. And they should be worried about what Rivers had to say, but the genre that's missing is a connection of how he got the effects he got. Or anybody could say, how Clifford got his.
Well, that was going to be my last question, really, because you started off wanting to be a writer, and much of the attractiveness of your work is in the crafted writing, but you also said over the last couple of days when we talked that whatever you did was not what you'd recommend to others, but it would be nice to know what it is that you do.
No, I'd recommend it. Yeah, well, as I also said last night in that talk we had, I consider myself essentially a writer. I mean, I happen to write about anthropology, but I could write travel books or something else. I mean, this is what I do, and I am an anthropologist, and I don't think, but writing is to me an autonomous good in itself. It's not just a deco or decoration. How I write? Well, I write in a way which I don't recommend to anyone else. I write by hand. That in itself, I suppose, is all right, but I write sentence by sentence. Paragraph usually is the main unit, and I get it the way I want it, and then I go on to the next one, and it takes a long time. But I don't write drafts. There are no integral drafts of anything I've ever done.
I mean, it's complete when it's written.
Yeah, when I write the last sentence, it's over. But it's been fuddled with all the way, and there's a constant, nowadays with the computer, it's so much easier than it used to be. It used to be with typewriter, you had to white things out and write in on pencil and paper. Now you play back and forth. I write something now, I type it on a computer so I can read it because my handwriting is terrible. I then correct it, and then play back and forth. and I build it up to a paragraph, and I build a paragraph up to a section up to a whole. But it's more like making a sculpture. You know, you push a little here and it comes out over there, and you push it back in there and it comes up here, and you just do that. And when you stop pushing, you got a statue. Good or bad, what it is, you've got it. But you don't have a draft statue that you just sort of make it. So it's more like that. It's more of a. I've never thought of it quite in the sculpturism before, but it's a little like that, or painting. You know, you do it until you get it, and you get it. And if you don't get it, then you have a busted painting, or a busted sculpture. And if you do get it, well, you've got something you're at least willing to display. And it's more like that that I work.
How long does it take you to write a paragraph? I mean, on average, are you talking...
I usually write, when I'm really working, and I work consistently, I'm just... A paragraph a day is the most I ever get done. And sometimes it doesn't go that fast. And sometimes, again, this pushing and pulling business, you go on for a while, and then you say, no, it's not working. And you go back and start over. But you don't go back and redraft what you had. You go back and change it. Again, the sculpture thing is better. You know, you just do it. And if it really gets screwed up, you just abandon. I have abandoned things. I mean, just this isn't working. It's not going to do. And you just give it up. But it takes me to write. Well, I've just done this thing for, not that it's that great, but I just did this thing for you guys, which is now, it's about 35 typewritten pages. Took me 2 months, 3 months, 2.5, 3 months. And doing nothing else, I mean, because I don't have to teach or anything, so I could do it all. But I don't advise that, and that's not, it sounds self-congratulatory to say it that way. I think, I know people who write beautifully who don't do it that way, write much more rapidly and are much better. But it just has to do with temperament and style and maybe genes. I don't know what it is, but and an enormous anxiety that I have in writing. It's very hard because I enjoy having done it. Yes, I enjoyed while I'm doing it. It's painful. It's extremely painful. But so is Fieldwork. I mean, yeah, I enjoy it in a sense. Yes, that's what I do. But I don't. It's not happy. No, it's not.
We've got a couple of minutes if there's anything else that I've missed out that you think. We haven't talked about Karen, obviously, who has been your companion for some time.
Yeah, well, my first wife was companion through much of the first part of it. And then Karen has been both in Morocco and Indonesia with me for some of the times.
And you said at one point that you never did Fieldwork on your own. So.
No, I don't think I don't think I could do it. I never tried it, but without Hilly in the first, really the much of it, the bulk of it, and Karen thinking, but I think I probably would have gone another. We were talking about how hard Fieldwork is and difficult to do it alone. I admire people who can, and maybe I could have. I don't know. I never did, and I don't see that I could have done it without somebody to support.
Did they read your material?
Yeah, both do. Both read over it, and both are excellent. Both are excellent critics. Luckily, I married, and they're both anthropologists, of course. Hilly's an excellent. Well, so is Karen. Hilly works on the same things that I do, more or less, or at least the same general areas. Karen does not. She works in American Indians, but they both are excellent anthropologists in my view, and they're very good critics, prose critics.
Well, I think that's a nice point to end on. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.